Okay. Hello and welcome to Childhood and Society SIG, difficult dialogue strand today with Sandra Linden and Deborah Laxton from Chichester University, who will share their research findings with us relating to how does a co-produced mindfulness approach support young children to develop self-regulation skills. So just some housekeeping before we get going. Today's session will be recorded and available on the SIRS Children and Society SIG space for your perusal, along with previous recordings and sessions for you to engage with. So the Childhood and Society sessions offer a safe space for respectful networking, sharing and dialogue opportunities, and hopefully collaboration for future projects and writing. So before we do start, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Sandra Linden from Chichester University is a reader in childhood and social policy. She is a research champion for childhood and a programme coordinator for the BA Early Childhood Honours Level 6 top-up. And Sandra has worked with children and young people for over 20 years as a qualified teacher and educational psychologist. Her interests include poverty, mindfulness practices, homelessness, intergenerational practice, and narrative methodologies. Our co-presenter is Deborah Laxton, who also works at Chichester University as a senior lecturer in education and early childhood lead, where she currently teaches across initial teacher training and education provision, focusing on early years education in preschool settings and primary schools. Deborah's career has focused throughout on the care and education of young children, and her research interests explore translational research and the movement of research-informed knowledge translating into professional use, and how it can impact on educator practice to enhance the lives and experiences of young children living in global crisis settings and also in the United Kingdom. So I'll hand over to our presenters now, and we look forward to some questions and engagement at the end of your presentation for the difficult dialogues session. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much, Angela. We're really delighted to be here this morning, and I'm looking forward to the session. So as Angela said, we're going to be talking about our project, about mindfulness and how that can support children's self-regulation skills. So I'm Sandra, and I'll be doing the first part of the presentation, and Deborah will be doing more of the second part.
Yeah, so just a quick bit about the presentation. We're going to look at our project first, just letting you know a bit about the background, our aims and objectives. Then we'll talk about some of the literature and the challenges with that. Then our methodology, our initial findings. We're at the very early stages of analysing our findings. Then outputs and outcomes, and then that's going to follow by a discussion about some of the difficult dialogues that we've gone through during the process.
Lovely. So the aim of our research is quite broad. So it was to investigate how a mindfulness approach can support young children to develop self-regulation skills, and we were working with 4 maintained nursery schools. So the objectives, again, were quite wide-ranging. So part of it was to provide educators with strategies that they could use to support children. We'll be talking about why that was particularly important to the nursery schools. Also, we talk about the research. There is very little research about mindfulness approaches for young children. So we really wanted to evaluate our intervention to see how effective this was, and to make a contribution to emerging research in this area. So the project context and rationale. So basically how it developed, we were fortunate enough to receive some funding for the university from the Research and Innovation Fund, and we created a research hub with our 4 local maintained nursery schools. And when we were talking to them initially about the project, there were several concerns that developed. from our discussions. One which I'm sure you're all very familiar with is the crisis in the early years sector. So across the private, voluntary and independent settings, but also to maintain nursery schools and cuts in budgets. The other impact, which again from our discussions with the nursery schools, was the impact that COVID-19 had on the children, particularly coming into the setting. So in terms of their emotional well-being and their communication and language. So part of what we wanted to do was to support the settings in reducing stress for the children and adults. And what came up from one of our, when we had our discussions with the nursery schools, with the head teachers, was that one nursery school was already taking a mindfulness approach. So one of the practitioners had got very enthusiastic and had done some research and training about mindfulness, and was very keen to see how this, or was already working with children in terms of supporting their self-regulation, but was keen to take this further. So that's how it evolved, really. I thought it's important just to say a little bit about what mindfulness is. This definition by Kabat-Zinn is the one that people typically use, and it's about paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experiences moment by moment. And you might well be familiar with the sort of number of apps that have developed about mindfulness and how it's become, I suppose, I don't like this word, but a bit of a buzzword, but also very much a practice which has been acknowledged recently as being supportive.
Sandra, can I just ask you to move the slides along? Just we're just seeing the first slide at the moment with everybody leisurely laying down. So that would be great just to move them on. Thank you. That's perfect.
We are moving the slides, so we'll just see why they're not.
It's moved now. We've got what is mindfulness. Is that the one?
Yes. Oh, that's strange.
It's come along now. Thank you. Thank you, Claire, for supporting me with that.
Yeah.
We'll leave it in this mode rather than share full screen.
Okay. So just to say that mindfulness, the way that we've taken it, is a very sort of broad approach, really, and we refer to what we're doing more as sort of mindfulness practices than maybe mindfulness in its sort of purest definition, if you like. The research about mindfulness is really interesting. So there's a lot of research which have been done with focus on adults and mental health. And there's strong evidence to suggest that actually mindfulness practices are beneficial for adults. Then when we were sort of looking at this and looking at developing the project, there's a colleague that we know in our psychology department who's a particular expert in this field. And I remember going to her and asking her about the research, and she said, well, there's been a huge research which is done by the Wellcome Trust over 8 years, and it's called Myriad, My Resilience in Adolescence. And it was really looking at introducing mindfulness practices into schools for young people aged 11 to 16, and it was a huge project. And when the results came out, they were quite disappointing, because what they found was that mindfulness was no more effective than other similar approaches. But when you dig a bit deeper into it, it wasn't necessarily that the mindfulness practices weren't effective. It was that actually young people didn't want to do it. So I think it's more than 80% of the young people taking part in the project didn't engage with the practices, so they just didn't do them. Those who did do them did report better mental health when they were followed up. Interestingly, which was quite pertinent for our research and taking it forward, is that the teachers benefited. So those who undertook the mindfulness training, they reported things like less burnout. There's less research about mindfulness for preschoolers, and the research that does exist does suggest that it's beneficial for children's behaviour, self-regulation and perspective taking, and that was encouraging for us because we've got a particular focus on self-regulation. Angela, can I just check, can you see the slides moving okay?
Yes, we've got the training and intervention one up now. Thank you.
So what we did, it was a small project. We started last year in November, and we wanted the project to be sustainable. So we took a train the trainer approach, and each of the nursery schools identified a mindfulness champion. So that was somebody who was going to be trained and take this forward in their setting. The mindfulness lead, that was a person from the nursery school, so one of the educators who had done some particular training on this herself and had already introduced it to the setting. So she basically trained the other mindfulness champions, and we had a lovely morning where they all went to the nursery school and were trained and got to observe it in practice. And then she put together a mindfulness bag for them and resources to use in the group time. And we go through this on another slide, but I'll tell you all about what's in the bag. And basically, it was a 10-week intervention. So the mindfulness champions, once they've been trained, they then went back to their settings. They got consent to carry out the intervention. And they delivered these mindfulness practices to their key children over a 10-week period. So our methodological approach, so in terms of evaluating it, we took an interpretive approach because we wanted to find out the different perspectives of the children and the educators, and these different understandings that they might have been involved in a mindfulness project. And because it was exploratory, you know, we felt this was a good way to go about it. So we did some interviews with the mindfulness champions before they started. We did some follow-up interviews once they'd finished their practices, and then we went into each of the different settings to observe one of the group times with the children and the educators. So these are some of the approaches which they took. So I've just given you a sample. So very much the mindfulness lead, she spoke a lot about, you know, checking in with children in terms of how they're feeling and also the language. So she talked in terms of like sort of big emotions, feeling a bit fizzy. So these sort of very relatable terms for children. How are you feeling today? I don't know if you come across Hoberman balls. They're in the photograph, those sort of coloured spheres. And they use these as breathing balls because you can hold on to them and sort of make them expand a bit like your lungs. So again, it's getting over this idea of breathing and doing it slowly. They also had a little chime bar. So they would play the chime bar, and then the children would listen really, really carefully and put their hands up when they could no longer hear it, just to get to really focus. They all made glitter jars with water and glue and glitter. And this was used as a representation of what happens when we have big emotions. And if we shake the jar, all these big emotions sort of swirl around and we can't see things clearly. But then if we wait and watch, all the glitter will go down to the bottom. The emotions are still there, but we're feeling calmer. They had a puppet as well, which was like a talking friend. So again, the puppet would come out of the bag and it might be feeling a bit sad or something had happened, and the children would be invited to make suggestions how they could make the puppet feel better. Then you might see a little meerkat in the picture. So they also used sort of soft cuddly toys as breathing buddies, and the photograph at the beginning of the presentation where everyone's lying on the floor. So this was some of my students, as you said, and the children would put their little breathing buddy on their tummy, and then they would try and make it go to sleep by making their tummy going up and down. And some of the children, actually, we got in our data from our mindfulness champions, actually would fall asleep when they were doing that. And then things like affirmation, so things like, inviting the children to join in affirmations like, you know, I feel strong, and things like that.
So over to me now, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of our preliminary findings. So the mindfulness champions found the train the trainer model was highly effective. The passion and knowledge and experience of the mindfulness lead right from the beginning inspired those mindfulness champions. They really enjoyed the range of activities, the fact that the resources were made really clear to them, and they were then able to observe 2 group sessions during that morning where they were seeing them being put into practice. That seemed to be particularly useful. Also because they were watching these happening in a nursery school, so they could see that it was relatable and transferable, and that they could adapt things that they saw fit, but they had a basis that they could use. Also, the mindfulness champions initially demonstrated some uncertainty around defining the terms self-regulation and mindfulness. We've got some quotes on the next slide, so you'll see some of their comments. But I think it was being asked to define it. When they started to talk about it, all of the mindfulness champions were able to give pertinent examples of what self-regulation looked like in their practice, or what mindfulness might look like for particular children and how they could support that. So whilst they felt they were uncertain, their examples suggested they did have some sound understanding around the terms. All of the mindfulness champions spoke of stress and challenge being part of everyday nursery life. It was quite humbling to hear. I sometimes feel that I'm in an ivory tower here. And when you heard how much they still care and how much they want to do, but how terrifically challenging it was. They spoke of a challenge in terms of the impact of COVID. They all mentioned the impact of COVID, that children already in the nursery schools displayed challenging behaviour, but that there was more dysregulation in the setting than previously. That children's communication and language difficulties had increased, and again that was impacting on dysregulation in the setting. They spoke about staffing being an issue, time and space to concentrate on your practice and being able to develop. All of those things just showing how stressful it was for them. However, despite the current challenges, they all claimed excitement right from the very beginning. They were really positive about the project. When I was looking at the findings, for me, the word hope came to mind. It seemed that it offered some hope, a window that the mindfulness champions could try to step through to support themselves and their children and the children in the wider setting. Again, right from the beginning, they were talking about this will help all children, not just their key children. Mindfulness champions showed professional interest and inquiry. They were wondering how children would engage with it and engage in particular activities and how they might gel as a group. That was one example from one mindfulness champion. Another one had a particular child in mind, and they were wondering how a particular intervention they thought might be suitable for that child and really help them because they'd be interested in it and how that might happen. They were using terms like fascinating and reflecting themselves. Mindfulness champions certainly knew their key children well. They were immediately talking about particular children that they thought they could target for the intervention, as well as using it as part of their group times. They certainly wanted the best for those children, and they wanted it to support all children across the settings. It sounds like rose-coloured spectacles, and I can't tell you how Sandra and I have looked at this and debated it ourselves, trying to find any negative feedback from mindfulness champions other than the stress and strain and pressure on others. There really wasn't any at any point in the project. So these are some of the quotes. I'm sorry, we did want the slides to come up one at a time, so it wasn't quite so too many to see all at one time, but unfortunately it's not working. So if I just take you first of all to the bottom left, the 2 smaller quotes, these are both about the definition. So I'm not highly knowledgeable about self-regulation. I'm at the very early stages of understanding mindfulness. But then if you look at the one at the top in the middle, there was an explanation where with mindfulness, there's a space between the stimulus and the response. And I think that space promotes self-regulation. That space can be the difference in them lashing out or being able to express themselves, or just to stop. If we look at the bottom right, the gold one, that's talking about having all that knowledge now from the training. At some point, I'll be able to mobilise all the bits and bobs that I'm learning. But at the moment, I do feel like a child myself. I'm just a sponge. I'm soaking it all up, and it's a joy. Then top left, they're talking about the training. So, that it was fantastic. I have to say that, again, everyone said that the training was brilliant and fantastic. And I think partly it was having time out of their own settings to talk with others, to reflect on practice, and to realise they're not alone. And then they talked about that balance of activities. And it was so valuable because, you can see how it can translate to your own setting. The top right shows an example of one particular person thinking about a particular child, a child who finds nursery very difficult, very stressful, and becomes overwhelmed. I'd really like to start trying some of these strategies and to see if it actually has an impact on him. But again, that positivity, which I think it really will. Then at the bottom, there's one about COVID again, and I just thought this quote really summed up the feeling that was coming around, that like the world is on our shoulders because of COVID and all the other worries of the world. There really was a sense that this is a sector under real duress. And then the last one, I hope it helps with some of the behaviours that we see around nursery, because I know that all the behaviours are for a reason, but sometimes it can be quite challenging, and it would be really good to have some strategies that we can put in place where we can see these behaviours exhibiting in the nursery. So again, this looked like that hope that this could be something that we can really use and be helpful.
Angela, can I just check that you can still hear us?
Yep, loud and clear, and really provocative as well. I'm trying to write some notes in on the chat. Yeah, keep going. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, so then moving on. So the post-intervention findings. The mindfulness approach was certainly beneficial to individual children and key groups. So there were lots of examples given about individual children. I'm just going to read one of those out to you. So I was intervening with one of my particular people, and he was getting himself really emotional. He'd been running around, and then he'd hurt another child, and then he was throwing something, and just getting him to breathe on the spot. Just take some breaths. Let's just try and breathe and feel your heart. Even just that much was enough to bring him back down and kind of go, oh, right, okay. I just think that, just having that strategy is a massive benefit for him now and going through school. He's going to have so much to deal with when he gets to school, and then on to secondary, and then on to adult life, actually. Those strategies, I think, are really important for health benefits as well. Life is so fast-paced, and being able to bring yourself to a calm state is crucial. To find some calm as well, which he was doing this morning. Yeah, I need to be on my own. I just need 2 minutes to myself. And that wouldn't have happened before. And there were examples over examples. There were only 4 mindfulness champions, but they all spoke about at least one particular child. And then their key groups. They talked about going into their key groups, carrying out some mindfulness activities to begin with, that calmed all of the children down, and during the session, they were much more focused. So mindfulness champions spontaneously shared examples of children modelling breathing techniques and collecting resources for their peers. So this is where the project was overflowing onto the floor of the nursery. So children that were struggling to regulate, other children would bring the breathing ball to them or say, stop, you just need to breathe. And that was an exciting thing for the mindfulness champions to see happening spontaneously throughout the nursery. So all the mindfulness champions are continuing with these approaches and strategies in their own groups. The project has come to an end in the 10 weeks, but this is now part of their practice, and they're very keen to roll it out. They've become genuine advocates of the approach. They've seen the difference it's made to their children. They're eager to roll it out. And already their colleagues are asking about it. Some have already started themselves to add some strategies. The breathing balls are out in at least one nursery all around the nursery floor. So again, things are continuing to roll out, and we're going to look at that a bit more in a moment. They said that ongoing support by the mindfulness lead was really useful. So the mindfulness lead went to visit each setting about halfway through the project. This gave them time for professional dialogue, to ask questions, for the mindfulness lead to remind them of different practices that they might not be using or had forgotten about. But again, they said how helpful that was. And definitely the resources were absolutely key to children's engagement and understanding. In the next slide, you'll see one of the comments from one of the mindfulness leads. So the bottom left, this mindfulness lead said, it's quite complicated things, emotions. They're quite difficult to, I suppose, explain or understand what they are, but it's the mindfulness is making it more tangible. And one of the examples was the jar. When the child is feeling fizzy is the term that they've been using. That's when everything in the jar is all rushing around. But that actually seeing that settle maybe makes those emotions a bit easier to understand and more tangible. One of them in the top said, I think it's improved the emotional well-being side of my group time, and my own teaching has gone forward. So that definitely links to that myriad research about the teachers feeling that they were learning and their own mindfulness practices were impacted. The other two on the right are to do with parents. So they talk about passing on some of the information to parents. So parents had already signed consent forms, so they were aware of the project, but they were certainly coming and asking for things and getting breathing balls at home in this example and setting up quieter areas. And the mindfulness champion was saying, this is the biggest thing for me. It was so brilliant to be able to pass on some information that would support them. And the one at the bottom is a really lovely comment. And we've had lots of comments from parents saying, oh, when I was telling my child off the other day, or we were having words, and the child told them, just breathe, mummy. So, you know, genuine impact going on at home and an understanding that maybe when you're losing control, there is something you can do about it. So it's empowering. Another teacher has watched some mindfulness sessions and is taking them on herself. That's the middle bottom. And then the top left, quite often when they came into group time buzzing, that's that example of the fact they were more focused during the session. With the rollout, just to say that the head teachers have seen the impact of the intervention. They've listened and heard. I don't think they've had a lot of choice, to be honest. They've heard their mindfulness champions talking about how effective the approach has been, and they are on board to support that and roll it out, which again we're going to come to shortly. So outcomes and outputs, this leads straight onto it. So in September, there's going to be 4 nursery schools all coming together for an inset training day. And this is going to be for everyone from the 4 maintained nursery schools, rolling out those particular interventions for everybody. We're also looking at extending the training of those mindfulness champions. But the second bullet point's a really important one. So Sandra and I and the mindfulness champions talking about how stressful it has been and how difficult it has been in the nursery settings. And one of the mindfulness champions talked about it's really difficult to go into your group time, and she said when your own head is buzzing and you're fizzy. And they were talking about you need to carry out mindfulness practices yourselves in order to enable the children to be able to be mindful in the group sessions. So we thought it was really important to try to value the work that the nurseries are doing and try to provide educators with some strategies they can use. And again, that's come from the research and what the educators are saying themselves. Sandra and I are planning to write 2 research articles for publication, one related to the impact on the children from the practitioner's perspective, and one about the educators and the impact on them. And as you've seen from the very initial slide, it certainly is informing our own teaching, and we're using this with our own students. So on to difficult dialogues then. So we're sort of moving now away from our project, but to share with you some of the things that have not necessarily caused great difficulty at all, but Sandra and I have reflected on these. So over to you.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about these stuff?
Oh, sorry. Yes, so it is me first. So staff under pressure. Here we're back to the thing that we've come back to numerous times during this presentation. But actually, one of the things we really needed to think about at the beginning was how the project could be manageable and to be viewed as being something useful that was part of day-to-day practices, rather than adding something new that you had to do at a different time. So they were given time for the training, and then it became part of their group time. So that did seem to make a difference. We have to continue to think about this because, again, the mindfulness champions said they were worried about their colleagues, but at the same time as saying they're worried about rolling out because of pressure on their colleagues, that was completely balanced by them saying, but actually they really want to do it and they're really interested, so they'll do it. But all the time, it has been a bit of a difficult thing we've needed to think about.
Yeah, and one particular circumstance for me. So Deborah and I, we shared out doing the interviews with the mindfulness champions. And one of the mindfulness champions that I was going to interview, part of the research as well, which we haven't talked about, but they were writing journals, and she had produced the most beautiful journal about her experiences of taking part in the project. And we had the interview all set up, and then very sadly she had a personal bereavement happen, and I was caught between this difficult place, knowing that she really wanted to sort of share her experiences, but having this very sad event and being respectful to that. So that was difficult, navigating that when you don't know people particularly well, but that's not particularly this project, probably something which we might experience in all sorts of research projects. The other thing that when we were reflecting about the difficult dialogues was this whole idea that we wanted the project to be co-produced and co-created. So when we had the initial discussion with the maintained nursery schools, we spoke to all the head teachers, and it was deciding on a common focus. And I remember that meeting, we were trying to hold back, thinking, you know, in terms of our own agenda, what we might think is a good idea, and really let it come from the group. And there was this consensus about, well, actually, you know, should we do something to do with COVID, or should we focus on communication and language, children's behaviour? And it was really when this nursery school shared the work they've been doing about mindfulness that seemed to be something which pulled together these threads, and which sort of came from the head teachers and their nurseries and what they felt was most important. And that leads on to really then when we started to investigate mindfulness and came across this research from the Myriad project, and being a bit daunted by that, because it had been in the press as well that actually mindfulness doesn't work, and how that had been sort of slightly misrepresented, because it wasn't that it didn't work, it was that young people didn't want to engage with it, which is a different thing. And we thought, well, is this term mindfulness a bit sort of, I suppose, stigmatized really? Is it something we should be using? Or should we go down a different route? Should we maybe focus on self-regulation or brain power? I'm going to hand on to Deborah to explain a bit where those terms came from.
So there were different perspectives. The mindfulness comes with, it's quite a loaded word. People have all sorts of assumptions about it. And so that could be difficult in itself. Sandra and I were quite interested in bringing the self-regulation into it because of the changes to the EYFS, and that educators are well aware of it and understanding of it is developing. So that felt like maybe it should be in there. And the mindfulness lead was using terms like brain power. So we were coming together, and we're still coming together with this actually, and finding a way forward. And we think the way forward is going to be based on this project to define mindfulness ourselves and come up with a common definition of mindfulness that we'll use going forward, which is again based on research and our own findings. But I think that could help these difficult dialogues quite significantly by allowing that to be a common definition for us all.
So thank you very much for listening to our presentation, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your comments and questions and thoughts about our difficult dialogue. So we're going to come off the presentation now and come back to where we can see everybody.
Okay.
But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you both, Deborah and Sandra. A wonderful presentation, really intriguing and so needed at this time, you know. And again, difficult dialogues, the concept of dialogue, you know, opening up these unsafe spaces and what happens with, you know, is intriguing. So I'm sure there's lots of questions from the audience. If not, I will absolutely hog every last minute left to open up dialogue. But if anybody'd like to just show that they have a question, please. So we've got Claire Harding and then Abel. Anybody else showing? Well, I'll start with Claire Harding and then I'll go to Abel and then we'll see where we go from there. So thank you both very much for your expertise and for sharing your research.
Thank you, Angela. And thank you, Sandra and Deborah. That was so interesting. It mirrors quite closely some research I did as the second year of my master's over 3 years when I was teaching in the classroom. And to answer a question, Angela, that you put into the chat, which was, I wonder why children don't engage with mindfulness. So I was teaching in a junior school, so I don't know about those who are 11 plus. However, I've got a daughter who's at secondary school and they're just eye rolling at anything to do with that kind of thing at that age. But when I did my mindfulness research, I very much wanted it to be something that was targeted at specific children who teachers thought it might really benefit, but also looking at making it accessible to anybody across the school in quite a big school. So we did it as a mindfulness club. And one of the most interesting findings was that the younger the children, the more open they were to the techniques that we used. And the older they were, the more likely they were to drop out after a week or 2 or 3. Partly, I think, because they had so many other demands on their time. But using that little bit, I mean, it was just a little bit of action research, but using that, I then kind of chose the techniques, including the glitter jar, interestingly, to use with my own year 5 class. And really, you know, just want to echo the huge benefits that the children found from it. And my question is, and it's not one that can be answered, I don't think, but I'd be really interested in collaborating on it at some point. My question is, how can we make this more accessible and attractive to all the pupils that can benefit from it? I think part of it is what you're doing, which is catching the kids when they're really, really small and getting them into that habit of doing it so that it's almost, I mean, as simple as breathing, just knowing how to breathe. But, you know, what can we do for those hundreds, thousands of children who have been so affected over recent years and really need it? You know, how can we make it cooler, I guess, cooler for pre-teens?
Yeah, I think, thank you very much, Claire, and shall I go first? So just to respond to what you're saying, I think it's really interesting, and I think the beauty of the approach within the nursery schools, it was just part of the everyday practice. So even though it was introduced, I suppose, more formally, if you like, within those group times, all those different activities could just be used at little moments, which is what Deborah was describing. And I know some of them, you know, wanted to have, you know, and already do have the resources within the setting, but because they were introduced in the group time, then the children knew, you know, what they were for and how they could be used, which was really lovely. What I found interesting is that when I've taken this out to my students who are studying early childhood studies, I was wondering how that was going to be received. And what was really nice with one of the groups, one of the students said, well, actually, I've done some mindfulness, and, you know, and I know about breathing. And so I said, oh, fantastic, would you help me then? And together we did this little co-created practical mindfulness session. And I was very not sure whether it was going to be too uncool to lay on the floor. But after a few little sort of comments about, you know, who else has been laying on this floor, is it clean, and that sort of thing, once they got down on the floor, they absolutely loved it. And they said, well, can we just stay here all afternoon? So I don't know, that's not really an answer, but I suppose it's that fun element as well. I think sort of breathing can come across a bit, I don't know, boring or whatever, but actually, I don't know, it's like you say, it's so beneficial. It's trying to find the roots in, isn't it?
And I wonder whether the parents as well is the other way in.
Yes.
So because the parents in the project were seeing how it helped their children, they became invested in it. So if we can enable parents to see it as something that help their children, whether they're, you know, 2 or 3 or 15, 16, then maybe that is one way.
Yeah, had I not moved into teacher training, which I did midway through my master's, my next step was going to be to try and access it for the older children through chair yoga, which for me, when I did my mindfulness club, and I imagine it's similar in the early years setting, is it's about lying on the floor and having plenty of space and being able to stretch out. And I wanted to kind of get over that barrier of needing space and needing time and a separate place. So this idea of just being able to push back from your desk and do some yoga. But yeah, I joined university life instead. So maybe it's something I'll return to.
Probably need to do it with a staff sitting on.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Claire, for really connecting there. And hopefully there's some more future connections that can carry on from both projects together. So I know, Abel, over to you. You had some question and some feedback.
Many thanks, Sandra and Deborah, for your very thought-provoking talk. I'm very much into mindfulness myself. I follow on a regular basis the Oxford Mindfulness Foundation seminars. You know, they're free every day. I'm sure that you're aware of them. I found them very useful. Just two questions, I mean, very much related to the activities, you know, that you organize. First of all, I was curious to know whether you schedule these sessions at a particular moment of the day for the children, whether, for instance, was at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, because of course that makes, you know, lots of difference. I wanted, you know, to know about your approach about this, whether you consider that, or, you know, because if it becomes, of course, part of a everyday routine, I'm sure that, you know, you need to find, of course, a very strategic moment part of the day for that. So that's my very first question. The second one is related to the activity. So you mentioned this mindfulness bag, which is a great thing. But I was wondering, for instance, whether you included activities that, you know, I usually do, for instance, when, you know, I attend these mindfulness sessions, like, for instance, the input of poetry in these sessions, or imagining, you know, that we are part of nature. You know, I was thinking perhaps imagine, you know, for the children being a tree or a mountain, you know, for the, of course, also in terms of, let's say, strengthening, you know, the link with the nature, and not just being together with people, but of course with the whole, with the, you know, nature and the universe. So these are my two questions. But many thanks again.
Yeah, do you want to start? Shall I start?
Yeah.
So just on the timings, they fitted in with the group time. So it was entirely in with the routine of the nursery. So they were often at the end of the session. But one of the practitioners was a wraparound care. So she was using it as the children were coming in as transition in the day and at the end of the day when they were really tired. So actually the way she was using it was very different to the way some of the others were using it in their specific sessions at the end of, just before lunch or last thing before they go home. But it was whatever worked for the practitioners, really.
Okay, thank you.
In answer to your other question, I absolutely agree about the use of nature being really important as part of mindfulness. And as we move the mindfulness champions forward, I think it's definitely an element that will come in. But at this stage, it was a 10-week, here are some resources that can help you to develop this in your group home. So it was to contain it more really and make it seem achievable. I think that's where I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. And also I think some of the things that you were saying about sort of imaginings as well. And I was thinking back to what Claire was saying about yoga, and that was something which I've been thinking about actually. I'm connected with a project. I know another educator who does yoga with very young children, and I think there's a quite a synergy between yoga and mindfulness. I think they go together really nicely. So I think we're still developing this concept of what is mindfulness, and how can that be developed. But I totally agree. I think this is just the beginning, and it would be really nice to develop that further. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Jane, who's got a question for you both. Thank you. Thanks, Abel.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think it's really important and interesting. And I think, kind of taking it to the context of early childhood is really novel and important. And I think I do agree with what's being said about, the openness of very young children to have a go at things because they're not so self-conscious, and particularly if it's bodily. So my question really was in response to maybe the question you posed, which was, why isn't it appealing? Mindfulness, what is it? The baggage that comes with it. And I wonder if it has something to do with the therapeutic discourse that maybe mindfulness is seen to fall into, that, we need to know children and to fix them, and it kind of falls in with this developmentalist logic that children are progressing along predictable ages and stages, and if they fall without that or they behave in ways that are not aligned to this normative expectation, then they're somehow seen as deviant or in need of regulation. So my question really, and I suppose it is quite a difficult question, but does mindfulness, because of these kind of therapeutic connotations and kind of the way it taps into a particular conceptualization of child as non-normative, is that perhaps the reason there's resistance to it? Because, it's part of an apparatus of trying to cultivate a particular sort of child, a normative sort of child. So, I don't know. I suppose I think in terms of self-regulation, I think it's quite problematic. I think maybe children don't need to regulate necessarily. Maybe they need to go wild. Maybe they need to be running, and really being quite feral, and for that to be okay. So I don't know. It sits a little bit uncomfortably, the idea that children need to be calm and contained and regulated, and they need to know how to self-regulate. So I don't know. I'm just sort of throwing it back.
I think it's a really interesting point, and it's certainly something that came out of the training, that children need to express emotions, and it's okay to express emotions. And actually, I could have put some quotes up that absolutely say that. And part of that affirmation is, it's fine to feel this way. It's fine to do this. And then it is how can we manage that and make you feel okay about it? And obviously, there is some difference in how that 2-year-old might behave to how some 5-year-olds or 10-year-olds might behave, but equally there may not in the, you know, in the different and individualness of children. So I wouldn't want it to appear that we were suggesting that there is an expectation that because of mindfulness you can self-regulate all the time. But I think it's a tool that can help children in that moment to become calmer.
I think, just to respond to that as well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it's I suppose it goes back to that in terms of children's behaviour, you know, and are we there to manage children's behaviour by imposing techniques on them, or are we sort of alongside them, sort of supporting them? And I think, as Deborah said, you know, there was certainly a very strong emphasis that, you know, all emotions are okay, but certainly what we wouldn't want to be doing or communicating is that we're there to sort of suppress children's emotions. So I think I probably need to think further about that, actually, because I know that's something which, when I'm teaching about understanding children's behaviour, and it is a very thin line, and I think it's very easy to, I suppose it was to get into these binaries really about what is acceptable, what isn't. Okay, we're saying all emotions are good, but are some emotions better than others? So hopefully through this understanding, children would come to a greater understanding of their emotions. I think what was interesting was I suppose, the empowering sense. I was really struck by that quote that Deborah pulled out about the child who is saying to their mother, you know, breathe, mummy. And I thought that was fascinating, actually. But yeah, thank you for that question. I shall ponder on that some more.
Yes, also there's complications around mindfulness, because in some ways, you know, the colouring thing and mindfulness seems to be that colouring is for everybody, and people kind of accept that colouring is okay. It's just tricky at the moment, and I wonder whether it will become clearer with time or not. Thank you, that's really interesting.
I think maybe worth pursuing is the terminology that's used.
Yeah.
Because of course, as you've talked about, you know, there's a very, very close link with yoga, there's a very close link with meditation, there's a very close link with all of these kind of being present in the moment in yourself and feeling bodily sensations, which takes many different forms. So I think that maybe it's problematizing some of the language that has come to be associated with mindfulness, and potentially coming up with alternative language or drawing from other related spaces that then opens this out to be something more than the kind of the dominant discourse that seems to frame mindfulness in particularly unhelpful ways, perhaps.
Yes. I think that's certainly the direction that we would like to go on, because it was quite interesting having sort of completed the project and then going back to revisit definitions and thinking, well, actually, is everything that we're doing is not necessarily mindfulness. It doesn't come under that definition, if you like. So I think there was that thought, okay, we're doing mindfulness practices or approaches, and actually what do we mean by that? And that's certainly this debate that we're having currently within the people taking part in the project.
Yeah, and everyone's preconceived ideas
Yes.
which can come from very different places, including our own, you know. That's acknowledged.
Thank you, Jane. I'm just going to kind of pop in here now, because it's a really nice space, because the difficult dialogue strand of the Children and Society SIG group is based on dialogue. And my own research was looking at facilitation and dialogic pedagogy. And I'm really interested in the language and the approach and the kind of style of communication that was used. Because if mindfulness isn't, and I don't think it sounded like it was part of the practice, because you had train the trainers, so people were bringing it in. So I'm guessing it's kind of new approach. So obviously we've got in schools, we've got traditional teaching, we've got facilitation, we've got different types of engagements that happen. So I'm really interested in how mindfulness, what kind of talk, what kind of dialogue is used to bring it in, to promote it, to begin it, and to role model it, because it can't just happen. It's like and with my use of facilitation in my own research, facilitation is something that evolved, and I'm guessing we've got some real crossovers there with mindfulness. So I'm wondering if you notice any patterns of talk, dialogue, approaches that came in to kind of signal that mindfulness is going to happen, you know, because it's not just the talk, it's the movement, it's the, you know, the transition and the translation. So I'm really interested in that aspect, and I don't know if anything sort of came out from that.
I can talk about, unfortunately I wasn't involved in the initial training. I think neither of us were able to be there, which would have been interesting actually, as to how that was first introduced to the mindfulness champions. But I can talk about the observations that I did, and it was slightly different approaches. So there was a sense, certainly in one group that I observed, that, you know, we're going to go do some mindfulness now, and this little group of children were sort of gathered off, and, you know, and they did their sort of mindfulness, if that makes sense. And then in the other one, I think when we observed, again, I think being observed is really interesting, because people feel, oh, well, I must be doing my mindfulness practices because this is what they've come to see. And I think certainly there was felt, oh, I've got to include everything in this session because Sandra's come to see me and she wants to see that I've been doing all these things. But I think as it continued, and again, I can't think of the particular language, but it became, I think certainly from the interviews, it was something which was just much more natural, rather than, you know, we're going to do mindfulness. It was just incorporated into everyday things, really. But I don't know if you can comment on the language, Deborah.
And the observations I saw, there was definitely that this bag was coming out, and there would be something in the bag, and that bag signified that we would be thinking about our breathing, thinking about how we were feeling, what had happened to us that day. We would be laying down with our buddies, and that would help us, and we'd feel our hearts beating. So the bag in the observations I saw were pivotal moments in the children knowing what was going to happen next.
Wow, again, really interesting areas that I think you've opened, as Jane was saying earlier, and Claire, you've opened up and expanded this concept, and I really like the idea of it being looked at through the discipline of early childhood studies, particularly, and having your own language and meanings for it and defining them from inside early childhood studies out. You know, that's inheriting the terms but owning them, and then maybe translating and changing. That sounds really exciting. So I think we'll have to call it a close, I'm afraid, because we like to stick to our hour, because that's what you know, we promised for the lunchtime special. But we'd really like to thank both of you for your sharing your research, your expertise and passion on mindfulness and self-regulation and your research. And just to please do keep your links. I know Claire's really wanting to chomp in there and meet up with you, and I know I'd like to analyse some of it from my dialogic pedagogy aspects, looking at agency and self-determination, what happened before, what happened then, and what happened after. So loads of provocations and opportunities, hopefully, for us all in the future to have further dialogues together on this. So thank you both tremendously.
Thank you.
And thank you for everybody who's attended, because I know it's a post-holiday, so it's a tricky one, but the recording will be going on SIRS. And again, thank you, Jane, for leading Childhood and Society SIG, and for the difficult dialogues, opportunities for us to get into, you know, opportunities to talk about everything. And our next session will be a difficult dialogue session, and it will be on the 22nd of May, because we've got lots of bank holidays and a few kings being coming into glory. So we've got the next session on the 22nd of May, which will be looking at sustainability And again, has the same challenges. What does sustainability mean in early years? According to who? What does it mean through policy practice and so on? So we look forward to you joining us again if you're free for your lunchtime session. And thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. Lovely to meet you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to see everybody from far and wide as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll just stop the recording. Let me just do that. Yes.